Hey everybody, CyberTao back with you. We're continuing our examination of hanging pawns. We're going to be moving on to looking at games that feature strictly piece maneuvers against the hanging pawns. This is a little bit more rare because once the hanging pawns are next to each other, on the fourth in the case of the white hanging pawns or the fifth rank in the case of black hanging pawns, that B pawn or the E pawn break tends to be fairly instrumental in the fight against the hanging pawns. But it's also important to know of your options when it comes to strict piece maneuvering, in terms of generating pressure against the hanging pawns and trying to force concessions and weaknesses out of them. First game we're going to look at, this will be Ftacnik against Ftacnik-Lautier. This is 1988, so Lautier wasn't super GM status that he was destined to meet, but he was still a very talented youngster at that point. And Ftacnik, very creative chess veteran at that point. His games are very instructional. Ftacnik's white, so d4, knight f6, 3 e6. So the Queen's Indian defense. At this point in 1988, this was very much looked at as a very solid, boring drawing weapon. That's sort of turned a little bit. There have been enough theoretical innovations to make this a little bit more of a sharp weapon now, but it does have quite a bit of opening theory behind it. It's a little bit prohibitive in nature to prepare. But I would say less so than the Grunfeld. I would say the Queen's Indian still has at least some room for individual interpretation. What's going on there? Ftacnik plays g3. This is, of course, the main line. This is yet another part of opening chess that was created whole cloth by Akiva Rubinstein. This has been the main line pretty much ever since the Queen's Indian was invented. A3, this is the Petrosian variation. It's sort of interesting how this flank move, like A3, A6, H3, H6, it's become sort of a cornerstone of modern chess that these little pawn moves can have such a big impact on the position. So basically, the move A3 is designed to fight for the E4 square, because the knight would like to come to C3, but then black would simply play bishop b4. Now, this is one of the other main lines. This is sort of a nameless Queen's Indian, Nimzo-Indian hybrid. So there's nothing wrong with this, but the idea of a3 is that it prevents that move, bishop b4, which means white's able to generate more pressure against the e4 square with this move, knight c3. This was very popular in the 80s, especially when Kasparov took it up. This was a very feared attacking weapon. Now a lot of its danger has been analyzed away, and I would say g3 is sort of back to being the main option against the Queen's Indian. Nothing wrong with the move, just it's had a lot of venom drawn from it. But g3, that is the main line. Bishop a6. This was actually Nimzovich's original idea. This sort of long fianchetto to immediately generate pressure against the c-pawn. Of course, bishop b7, this is the classical main line. One potential line. Then rook e1. This is a modern trend. Of course, normal move would be knight c3 here. But the idea of rook e1, basically, white wants to fight for the e4 square, so the rook coming to e1 is sort of designed to fight for that square. Eventually, he would like to move this knight to d2 to also fight for the e4 square, but he doesn't want to trade light square bishops. So in a lot of these positions, white's going to play something fairly circuitous, like bishop f1, and then and only then knight d2, to fight for the e4 square without trading those light square bishops off. So rook e1 sort of fights for the e4 square, and it gives that bishop a hidey hole where it can drop away where it's not traded off immediately by black. I'm not sure rook e1's necessarily better than knight c3, but it's a modern trend and it has a little bit more juice to it than the older main lines. But bishop a6, very aggressive. It actually scores better than bishop b7, so if I played the Queen's Indian, I would certainly choose bishop a6. Knight bd2, white just needs to guard this pawn somehow. There are a couple other queen moves, like queen a4 and queen b3 are both options. b3 is sort of the classical main line against bishop a6. Bishop b4 check, and then bishop b7. This is a very common two-step by this bishop. It draws the white bishop to d2, where it's really not well placed at all. It would prefer to be on d2, or b2. Then it drops back to e7. And this is one of many common positions from the mainline Queen's Indian. This is strategically tense position. This is a good fight to come. This is an equal position, and both sides have excellent winning chances here. Definitely a lot more winning chances than a supposedly sharp opening like the Marshall Gambits, where everything's analyzed up draws. But knight bd2, this is a bit more of a sideline, but it's perfectly fine. d5, one of many choices, but this is one I personally prefer, just immediately putting more pressure on that c4 pawn. Trade. Knight e5. These are all normal moves. Knight bd7. c5 immediately is probably best. In this pawn structure here, we're basically fated to head for hanging pawns, especially because this b6 move is included. If the pawn were on b7 instead, black could just play c6 and play sort of a Carlsbad structure, but because this pawn is on b6, moving the pawn to c6 would make it incredibly weak. It's not supported there. So black is sort of locked into playing c5 at some point to fight for the center. So, just an example line of c5. Of course, there's more details in the notes you can look at. But black's very comfortable here. This is a pretty comfortable hanging pawn structure. White has his own chances, of course, but subjectively I would prefer black just because black has nice control of the center because of his pawns, active pieces. This is a comfortable position for black. Knight bd7, that's a little bit more passive. That move c5, you're basically locked into playing that, so you might as well play that move you're locked into playing first, and then figure out where the rest of your pieces are going to go. Knight df3, queen e7, and now we get the c5 move. Queen a4, sensible move, looking to hop the knight to c6, possibly. Rook fd8, ignoring it. If black wants to be solid, this is a much more solid choice from black, but it really leaves no winning chances for black as well. White's got the bishop pair. This knight can eventually be kicked away from e4. This is an equalish position, but I think white has a small advantage because of the bishop pair. I think that black's choice of keeping the tension is much more sound, or at least more interesting. Rook fd1. This option here, trade on d7, then bishop g5, this creates a little bit of disharmony in black's position. So the threat is to take on f6, and then the queen can't take, because the rook on d7 would hang, so then black's pawn structure would just be shattered. Basically, black would have to waste a move by moving the rook back to d8. dx. Then queen h4. And then the fact that black's going to get another pawn weakness as well. I think white certainly has a little bit of an edge here. Black's going to have the bishop pair out of that. But let's just... h6 isn't the best move. I just want to get a position like it on the board. Black's got the bishop pair, but his pawn structure is just completely shattered. If you move the pawn back to g7, this is probably just an equal position. But the knight's got an attractive outpost on f5. Plus, combine that with pressure in the d-pawn with rook fd1. Maybe even drop the knight back to e3 to pressure that pawn. White's got a little bit of something to work with here. So rook fd1 is a little bit routine. Knight f8. And then knight d3. And this is where I really wanted to start the serious examination of this position. So, it's hard to choose where to maneuver your pieces against the hanging pawns when they're mobile. Now, really the main goal of pressuring the hanging pawns with pieces is that you're looking to generate some sort of concession. And almost always that concession is one of the pawns moving forward. Because when the pawns are next to each other, they're controlling all the squares in front of them, they can't be blockaded, they're very strong. But as soon as one of the pawns move forward, they're suddenly on the same color of squares, they're more easily blockaded, you can put pieces in front of them. Making one of those hanging pawns move is really the goal of piece pressure. So in these positions, a lot of times you'll see these knights maneuvering for better spots to get a better post where it can hit these hanging pawns. So the knight moves back to d3, it's technically a retreat, but because it's pressuring that c5 pawn, it's a superior post for the knight. Because that's the gravamon of the position for white. He wants to be pressuring these hanging pawns. So knight d3 is spot on. Bishop takes. This is basically forcing white to make a good move. He wants his knight to be on f4. That's a great post for that knight. Generally, you don't want to force your opponent to make good moves. Knight e6 is better, just improving that piece, defending the c-pawn, keeping the tension, forcing white to be the one to break that tension. F4. Just continuing development. And black is fine here. Trading on e6 actually helped black's pawn structure a little bit, but white couldn't keep that tension forever. Of course, this pawn on a7 is poisoned. Let's go back and look at that variation, because that is a little bit important. Bishop a6. That's the key move in these variations. Bishop a6 shuts the trap on the white queen, and so there's no way out, and black's going to win that queen. But in this final part of the variation, black's simply comfortable. White theoretically has a little bit better of a pawn structure. It's 3 pawn islands versus 2, but practically none of black's pawns are really weak here. So this is a very comfortable position. So bishop x f4 is just a bad move. It's forcing white to improve his piece, and suddenly white's got good prospects of developing pressure against the hanging pawns. Knight e7. This isn't the most active post for the knight. It's also blocking off a defensive route to this d-pawn. Knight g6. Black needs to challenge that knight immediately, because that's a very strong piece. Knight d3 is one option. And white's a little bit more comfortable here for sure, because white's pieces are very nicely coordinated to generate pressure against the hanging pawns. But black is also well mobilized. Black has finished all his developments, and he can potentially generate his own pressure. But knight 8 d7 is just too passive. It's allowing white to build up at leisure. When the side fighting against the hanging pawns is building up the piece pressure, the hanging pawns needs to be seeking their own counterplay. If the side with the hanging pawns doesn't achieve that own counterplay, then the side fighting the hanging pawns is just achieving pressure for free, and you never want to let your opponent pick the play for free. Knight 8 d7 is just sort of a routine move. So queen a3, excellent move. Sort of a bank shot move, but it's pressuring the c-pawn, which is all that matters in this position, is pressure against the hanging pawns. Knight dc8. Knight e1, it's thematic, it's maneuvering the knight to better posts, but knight d4 is actually a better route. So it's exploiting the pin of this c-pawn. Can't be taken because the queen simply takes. But the knight has access to more squares from this point. It can come to b3 to still pressure the c-pawn, or it can hop to f5, or it can hop to b5. So on d4, it has a healthier access to more important squares. G6 is one potential move. In the notes, I give queen e5. Then knight c2 is sort of the star move here. The knight's going to hop to e3 to pressure that d-pawn. b4, again, it's hard to look at positions with only piece pressure against the hanging pawns, because this b-pawn and e-pawn break, they're often so critical to fighting against the hanging pawns. This is just another good example of a b-pawn break. After knight e3, white has superb pressure from here. These hanging pawns, again, the concession you want to get out of the hanging pawns is forcing one of them to move. Once one of them moves forward, they're much more vulnerable to blockade and attack. In this particular position, white's doing fantastic. He's got knight x c4 as a threat here. White's doing great. So knight e1, it's thematic. Again, you want to be maneuvering your knights to better post to pressure these hanging pawns, but it's a little bit too passive. White deserves better. b3, classic move. You don't want to let that black knight hop into c4 for free. a5. This is a clear mistake. e3 is the best choice here, and just one particular. Just hop back before we move forward. This a5 move with the hanging pawns is often a crucial positional idea. In this particular position, black doesn't really have any kingside attacking ideas, so he needs to be generating his own counterplay. And that a-pawn push is often a way to generate counterplay, because the side with hanging pawns is going to be looking to give the defensive side their own pawn weakness to deal with. And in this case, the a4 break would give a weak b-pawn for black to focus on. So knight ed3 is a clear mistake. E3 is best. And then these moves are quite typical. This is a balanced position. White doesn't really have the pressure that he would like to have against the hanging pawns, but in return, black doesn't really have any kingside attacking chances, so nothing drastic is going to happen. But these pawns here are balanced out by the weak b pawn. That's basically the main positional idea of the a5, a4 break. This is balanced. Black's doing fine, but white's doing fine as well. Knight ed3 is a clear mistake. Knight fd7, this is another mistake in return. It's a hard move to play. g5 is if you're a strict positional player, a move like this is very difficult to make, because you'd rather hear nails on a chalkboard than move a pawn in front of your king side. But here, because the knight doesn't have access to the d3 square, it has to offsize itself to that ugly h3 square. And this is a huge edge for black. One potential line I give, just to show rook c5 isn't possible, really. So, and black has a huge edge here, just almost solely because of this offsides knight at h3. If this knight were on anywhere else, white would be doing just fine. But white is temporarily down a piece, more or less. So knight fd7, just completely routine. Knight b2, focusing on that a4 break. E3 was another line. And black has some activity, but I think white's also doing fine here. But knight b2, it looks a little bit strange if you've never seen the idea before. But again, the fight against the hanging pawns and against that pawn break is all that matters here. So it's normal for these knights to sort of hop around and maneuver like this. f6, e3, so the pawn defends itself, freeing this knight to hop to a better square like d3. Queen c7, stepping into a pin on the c-file, this just creates too many problems. a4, again, when you have the hanging pawns, a4, the a-pawn break in general, is one of your main positional ideas. k5, it's too early for the knight to take. Again, white suddenly has excellent pressure against both these hanging pawns. It's not even the extra pawn, because the extra pawn's in a2. White's not really up a pawn here, but the pressure against these hanging pawns is quite unbearable. h6, just one potential line. And this is balanced. So right now the hanging pawns are defended enough. White certainly has prospects of getting pressure, but black's going to get his pawn back on a4. And that c-pawn is certainly an asset instead of a weakness. But queen c7, just stepping into a pin on the c-file is quite weak. Knight e4, this is the right time to do that. So there's a pin on the c-file, plus this d-pawn is going to end up being quite weak. Knight a4 is the correct timing. a4, so now there's a threat of taking on d5, so the pawn has to be defended. Knight d3, queen b5 is better. The knight on f4 is quite optimal here, because it's holding all these pieces in place. The queen can just hop to b5 to pressure the c-pawn. And rook a8 doesn't work because of bishop h3, just smacking that rook. So knight d3 isn't bad, but it's not optimal. Knight e7, queen f4. Again, these sorts of piece maneuvers, and just to review the piece maneuvers we've seen, notice the theme is getting pieces off the board. When you're fighting against the hanging pawns, you want to try to get those pieces off the board, because not only does it remove any chance of activity for the hanging pawns, but it's removing defenders. In a lot of ways, the hanging pawns are a little bit easier to defend when there's some material off the board. Similar concept exists in hedgehog structures, where trading off a little bit actually robs the hedgehog of its danger, because it doesn't have any pawn breaks left. White's trading pieces off the board, it sort of helps immobilize these pawns, and it makes them a little bit weaker, because there's less pieces to defend them. Queen b6, and knight b2. And again, this is the right time to do that. Knight a4, it's a move that Tarrasch would not approve of at all. But in this particular position, the knight going to the rim spot of a4, that's its best outpost, because it's directly punishing that weak pawn on c5. In this position, the pressure against the hanging pawns is all that matters. So knight a4, that's its best post. Queen e6, knight a4, hopping right in. h4, very cute move. This is very thematic in these sorts of fianchetto positions. The bishop on g2 isn't great anymore, so white simply planning king h2 and bishop h3. And you also see this in the accelerated dragon in quite a few variations. Bishop a8, king h2, so threatening bishop h3. That would trade off that knight on d7 and collapse the c-pawn. c4, this is more or less a decisive error. f5 should at least be played to block that bishop out. And this is one potential line. This is a much better position for white, because all of white's pieces are just optimally placed to hammer these hanging pawns here. But for now, black is at least holding, and at least black could think about some sort of counterplay with g5 at some point. But c4 just starts shedding material. dx-c4, this is actually not correct. Bishop h3 just completely collapses black's position. One potential line. And black can't even take back on c4 because the knight on d7 would hang at the end of everything. So black's going to be losing even more material because the bishop's on h3. Also, if the queen went to e7 instead, bishop would just take. And then either way, black's losing material to a fork on d6. So bx-c4, it's natural, but it's not the best move. But this is also quite decisive for white as well. This pin on the d-file. Black's not even down material here, but white's pieces are so much better placed than black's pieces that alone is decisive. And the queen can't even take back, of course, because of queen e8 mate. So c3, sort of a last gasp. And again, the mating tricks in the back rank make all of this work for white. And I'll just give the rest of the moves briefly, because this is just decisive. And black resigned here. He could fight on. He could... Or probably just bring his king back to safety. Yeah, bring the king back to safety. White's up 2 pawns, and this a pawn's just going to queen. This is... For 2 grandmasters playing each other, this is a position that's quite over. So really, the key to the game, these positions where you pressure the hanging pawns with strictly piece maneuvers, they're a lot less thematic than the pawn breaks against the hanging pawns, because the piece maneuvers depend on the specific position. It's hard. There's no hard and fast rules that you can give for the piece maneuvers, where the queen knight always belongs in f4, or the king knight always belongs in d3, or what have you, because it strictly depends on the specifics of the position. Pawn breaks, you can give a little bit more general information on when a certain pawn break is going to work. But these piece maneuvers, it depends on the specifics of the position. But one generality you can take, a lot of the piece maneuvers against hanging pawns are going to be with the knights, in searching for a good outpost to start pressuring these hanging pawns. Because a lot of times, those knights are going to start out on f3 and c3, where they're not particularly well placed to fight the hanging pawns. That's where you start maneuvering those knights to get to better outposts. And a lot of what we saw from white was those knights hopping to better outposts. Some of it was a little bit inaccurate, but in general, it followed that sort of general trend of looking for better spots with the knights. Knight a4. Again, looking for a better outpost with the knight to pressure against these hanging pawns. Knight d3. Again, looking for a better outpost with the knight to pressure those hanging pawns. That's sort of the whole theme of the game. And again, knight b2. And again, it's sort of funny that it's headed for that square on the rim, where, according to the sing-song rhymes of old, it's grim. But it's a decisive positional maneuver here. But when you're looking for ways to attack the hanging pawns and to provoke weaknesses, a lot of times it's going to be maneuvering with your knights to look for a better outpost to fight against those hanging pawns, to either win material or to force some sort of positional concession in getting them to advance. So, excellent game from Ftacnik, a very typical play against the hanging pawns. We're going to continue this theme next game. I've got another interesting game by Jan Tiemann to look at, so we'll see you then.